What's up, art family? It's your boy Tay Payton of thebeginnerdrawingcourse.com, where I help you face your fears and get further faster on your artistic ascent. And today we're going to be drawing a cat from reference. So this one you want to follow along with, and I got chapters down below in case you miss a step or have a hard time on one step and want to chill. The reference for the cat is in the description box, but let's hop into the demo here. All right, so drawing a cat step by step. First, we want to look at the big shapes here. In this case, we have this shape of the head. We have this large bodily shape. And then we have a couple little pointy ear shapes, which we can mark off, I suppose, in sort of a greenish yellow. So this one's kind of getting hidden by shadow. So those are all the biggest shapes. However, if you want to get fancy and draw the platform the cat is on, then that's probably something like this, even though so much of it is lost in darkness, as we all are these days. Just kidding. And you have the tail right here, which again you can barely see. So these aren't really important things. The most important stuff is the stuff that has been in light. So the stuff in light here is just these big shapes, which after you recognize sort of the large shapes, then you can start to construct a guide for putting in the rest of the shapes later. And as a beginner, this is especially useful because what you're doing is you're looking at those big shapes, breaking them down, and then putting them into a context where you can draw them. So we'll just start off simple and kind of sketch those big shapes, and they don't have to be perfect. Again, we're just trying to get a rough idea of the overall things that we're seeing. And that rough idea we can always refine later. So it's kind of like when you see those how to draw picture books and then it shows one owl at the end and like two little circles, and it's like draw the rest of the freaking owl, but that's not what we're going to do here. So as you can see, even just based on these really simple dumb shapes, I can tell already that if I continue this guide that we're going to have some problems. So let's talk about that. First and foremost, you can see that if my shape doesn't extend all the way over here, we're not going to really account for the legs, which is already an issue. So we'll need to do that. And this is just called modifying your guide. So I'll do that, and this way the shape is going to be able to fit in the legs nicely. The second thing I'm noticing is the head is a little bit large to me. So what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and lasso that and shrink it down just a wee bit, make it a little more proportionate. And there we have the base of our cat. Now, what you want to do next is you want to break it down into the medium shapes. So the medium shapes, which I guess you could call the ears medium shapes, but they're just such an important part of the cat I included them. The medium shapes are the shapes that are going to fit within the big shapes, typically. So they might be on the outside of the figure or what have you, but in this example they all kind of fit together. So what we're doing then is we're breaking down the neck shapes, like this leg shape here, and this sort of chest shape, and we're probably going to have to grab this arm shape and this arm shape. So how can we start from a place where we know that is going to work if we're looking at this reference here? First and foremost, if you figure that, just as a matter of reasoning, most life biologically is symmetrical. In this case, it's the x-axis, but we don't need to worry too much about that. So we know that if there's a line of symmetry down everything, that if we draw that line of symmetry, we should be able to figure out where everything is going to be placed a little easier. So what I'll do on my guide then is I'll just go ahead and I will draw that line of symmetry. And in this case, it's going to be down the front. And what we're doing here is we're just marking off the forms and already giving those big basic shapes some three-dimensionality. And because I have this nice line now telling me that this is our point of symmetry, then I can make some pretty easy conclusions from this point on. And those conclusions are going to be where I'm placing some of the medium shapes. So let's place some of those medium shapes now, shall we, in a different color. So what are some of the medium shapes that you can see when you look at this image? If I take away the big shapes, let's say, what shapes are sort of mid-size? They're not as big as the head or the body, but some of them could be seen within the context of those already bigger shapes, as I've stated. So like we said, we have some of the paws and some of the chest shapes and maybe this hind leg and the tail or the stool. So right now it kind of looks like a little dummy or a mummy that's been wrapped up, but if we include the medium shapes, then we're going to start to see more of a drawing emerging. So how do we do that? Well, we look at our reference and we say, well, maybe I should measure where some of these medium shapes are coming in. So if I look at this big shape that I've already made from this contour, which is just a fancy way of saying the outside separation of the shape, if I look at this contour here, then I know that right about here is where the apex of the chest is. That's about as far as it goes out. So if I'm looking at that and I stop right about here, I'm going to be close enough. And you don't need to copy your reference perfectly. That is not what drawing is about. That's not what learning to draw is about. It's about understanding the relationships enough to get a good result. It's not about making a perfect printed, photographic copy. There's artists who do that. You can admire those artists. If you're one of those artists, no shade. But what I like to do is just to understand the relationships and the shapes, and then start to make my own stuff after I study enough of those things. But we'll get to that later. Basically, right now, I'm just going in and finding areas I can mark off. So let's say that's a good place to end the chest. So we'll just have that little line right there to remind us of that, after which we can kind of go up, and maybe where else would we stop for this other medium shape? What can we break this up into? There's lots of ways to break up shapes. Some of it is constructive and some of it's more based on like light and shadow, for example. So the shadow is here and the shadow is pretty much here too. So this is one way of looking at things, is to recognize the different shadow shapes, the areas of contrast. And all we're doing is looking at things and organizing the drawing we're making based on what we're finding. So you can do this, like I said, with shadow shapes. You can do it constructively. So next we want to go ahead and draw maybe where one of the legs is. So if we go and reason from that apex of the chest downward, then looks like one of the paws comes out right about here. And that's just fine to have a nice little simple shape for that. We don't need to draw every little morsel of everything we're seeing. That's a big beginner mistake. We want to just draw the large shape, or rather in this case, the medium shapes. So if you reason from that point, you should be able to see that the next part kind of just goes around there. And then what does it do? It jumps diagonally, just zoom right up there. So that's what we're going to do. We're just going to zoom right up there. And in this case, we're starting to piece our drawing together. It's kind of like a puzzle, isn't it? Or building maybe a model, if you've ever done that. Some of us didn't have the patience for that, and I did really well on some of them and not so well on some of the other more complicated ones as a kid. I just started drawing instead. So after that, we got to figure out, okay, well, what are some of the medium shapes in the face? Maybe we have the, sort of mouth shape, the cat muzzle. And this big, nice bulbous shape here is not really looking very reflective of what this actually looks like. But that's okay, because we can always erase and adjust later, but we want to have some place to start from. Otherwise, if we have nowhere to start from, it gets confusing. We try to just draw everything we see. There's no organization. But right now, we're just looking for medium shape. So let's just take that medium shape and squint at it. When you're squinting, you're going to see things differently. You're going to see a lot of the detail fall away, and the light and shadows become more apparent, and the shapes become more apparent. So that is a huge thing that you want to start doing as a beginner, is squinting at stuff. So what I'm doing is I'm just squinting at that muzzle, and I'm just kind of drawing it. And again, I'm not trying to copy this thing perfectly. I'm just trying to teach you how to draw and to get these basic shapes down. So there's one of the big shapes. Maybe I want to draw where it ends, so I'll just, lay in a couple lines that sort of give me an idea of that. And right now, it could be a dog, it could be a cat. The proportions are a little different here because we're not being super accurate with our proportions, but we're still just going through and learning how to break stuff down. So squinting and reasoning, okay, where are some of our other medium shapes here? We got this back leg, why don't we draw that next? So if we found out where this paw was, maybe we can find out where that back leg is with another diagonal line. So I'll just do that, and then we know that the leg should be somewhere in this vicinity. And again, when you're a beginner, don't worry about getting it perfect. You can be really fastidious if you want about this, but that's not the goal here. The goal here is just to learn the process for breaking something down and giving it a reasonable degree of accuracy so that you can even begin to capture it. So a lot of this is what I teach in the Beginner Drawing Course 2nd edition lesson 2, after we've gotten comfortable with our cubes and our cylinders and whatnot. Save the file quick. All right, so just step by stepping it, we have drawn the big shapes. We're starting to lay in the medium shapes, and it's starting to almost resemble a cat. We're constructing a cat, guys. Isn't this fun? So we have this right here, the back leg, and we can't see a whole lot within this, shadow area, so we won't really worry too much about that. But we do want to maybe get that tail in there and the top part of the stool, because it's a pretty important part of the composition. Again, you can make whatever artistic choice you want. You can omit it, you can play it up, but the stool is basically just your average ellipse, which is a circle in perspective, and those are not very simple to draw. So if you get it a little wonky, don't worry too much about it at this point. We just want to make sure that we're getting used to figuring out how we even draw, even from reference. So this is an important skill, is just learning to squint, learning to break stuff down, and learning to use different relative measurements and big shapes and medium shapes. So all that stuff we're covering right now. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to find what parts of this are important enough to even draw. Let's just shoot a diagonal line down here and another diagonal line kind of down here. And we're going to want to connect this up somehow, but not all lines need to actually touch. So we can just Control Z a couple times till we have something relatively close. And that's almost good enough. I'm being a little too picky here for a beginner course, but I am an artist after all. So anyway, you can see that as I'm putting these lines together, immediately a relationship forms and starts to enclose that space with just two lines, guys. So it's a very delicate dance not to get overly sketchy or make a ton of lines, because you're going to end up having to clean up more. You're going to confuse your own eyes, confuse the viewer's eyes. And when you're constructing things especially, we don't want a big mess. We want nice solid pieces. So that's a big thing. Now we got to look for our small shapes. We have our big shapes, our medium shapes, and our small shapes. So let's start figuring out things like where that little closed eye is going to come in, or where the nose is. So with that little nose, it's basically just an upside down kind of triangle shape. So we'll just do that. And again, we're going to look a little like a dog for a while until we begin to really adjust our shapes and make them more nuanced and fine. And you can see there's sort of this separation that's happening, a little upside down kind of curved Y shape. So we'll just do that separation, and that will begin to give us an idea, again, of a cat, because we're just copying shapes. We're just being faithful to the shapes to a degree, and that's getting us closer and closer to having a drawing that represents a cat, because we're drawing the shapes that make up the cat. And then, you start to notice little things like, okay, well, the jaw will connect right there. So I'll just maybe shoot a little tiny line there. And we're getting into the more detailed things now. These aren't really the details. They're just the small shapes. And the small shapes are important because they set the tone for the details. So you can go ahead and maybe adjust the ear a little bit. Just draw over that line to be a little more accurate to what the ear really would look like. So I'm just looking at this shape. It's definitely more curved. So I just kind of placed my curves around that edge. And then there's this one, which is not very apparent, but we'll go ahead and just kind of curve it off anyway to make it seem a little more symmetrical. And then of course we have a line that is doing a little more of a concave thing rather than a convex thing. So I explained that in the beginner drawing course lesson 1, concave and convex, but I'm going to make that line a little more concave because it's kind of convex in my drawing. So at this point, we're getting close to drawing the cat. We should probably break up this shape right here to kind of separate these paws from one another. So if this is the apex and we go down a little bit more, it looks like there's kind of an interesting stop right here. Maybe we look to that stop to help us pick where we're going to make those other shapes from and to kind of finish off where we started. So you can strike a couple different lines to make sure you get it the way you want it. And because we've made quite a few changes, I'm just going to copy this guy, make sure that I have another layer to refer back to, because I'm going to be erasing some stuff soon. Right now it's helpful to keep it in there so you see sort of the reasoning behind constructing the drawing. So at this point, we kind of have something that resembles cat, and we can start to strike some of these other lines where we see them. Some of these, again, small shapes, which are effectively just little lines that break up the paw, help it give a little more detail, a little more realism, even though it's very stylized realism. We're just trying to realize the shapes. As I said in one of my beginner drawing course shorts, your eyes and hands speak in shapes now. So that's really where we're heading with the matter at this point. All right, so if you got this far, congratulations, you have now reasoned your way to drawing the first mannequinized version of a cat. The shapes that make it up are now apparent. And again, it's not perfect. It's not exactly what we're seeing there, but that's not what we're focusing on. We're learning how to construct a drawing. And this constructive process works for pretty much anything. It works for figures, cars, machines, buildings, animals. Knowing how to look at big shapes, medium shapes, small shapes, and measure them and break them down and put them together is so crucial for drawing. So that's what we're learning here, is the ability to do just that. And now, since we've been able to do that, we can lower the opacity on this layer, which I often do, and we can start to get a little more detailed with things. We can finally do those delicious details that I know you guys want to do. So here's something super simple. I'm going to give you basically one technique that allows you to start to detail things. And it's just a matter of mark making. So mark making is doing stuff like this. It's just making a bunch of marks, lining them up, and enjoying the way they come together, whether it's kind of close or a little further apart maybe. And this is something that you practice. Again, Beginner Drawing Course 2, Lesson 1 is free on YouTube. I teach more about mark making there, so you can watch that video. It'll probably come up and recommended if you make it to the end of this video, which is great for the channel, really great for the watch time. So let's go ahead and start to think about, well, now that we have this constructed drawing, we can effectively trace over, which is not cheating, by the way, because we put it together. What can we do to make it look like a better drawing, like the next version of the drawing effectively? So we've not only drawn it once, we're drawing it again, but more certain, because we've essentially done a practice run and we've constructed how we're going to get it done. All right, at this point, we're going to go ahead and just look at the reference and look at our drawing and look at some of the differences and try to close the gap a little bit. We're not going to get too fastidious with it, but we're going to just make sure that we are closer to the reference than our drawing is. And that just involves going in and making lines that are more certain, which means I don't want you to like trace the exact boundary of your drawing, but rather just take it in little chunks like you see me doing here. Just looking at the reference, looking at the drawing, and mastering the skill of that, going back and forth, looking at one, looking at the other. And a big thing too that I haven't done that I usually do, but for the sake of editing videos, it's not as easy, is I'll flip the canvas. Because for some reason, your brain starts to relax on the errors. And if you flip the canvas, it's just like, whoa, okay, there's actually a lot of differences here, and some of them I don't want. So that's what we're getting at whenever we flip the canvas, is starting to look at what we do and don't want. And since we already have all these other shapes in place, we can start to do just a little bit of mark making based on what we're seeing in the other drawing. And the mark making we do should really just be telling us more about what's going on inside of those bigger outlines that we've been doing, those contours. The contour is everything on the outside, separating the form of the cat from the space around it. So it is the figure, and I'll get a brighter color here, it is the figure to the background. So I'm just tracing this here, and I want you to notice how kind of shaky the traced line looks because I'm just, running the contour. But when we're going a little, quicker, we get nicer lines. That's just a little tip. But this is the background, and this is the figure. And the figure is separated from the background by the contours. And the contours can be made up of lines, they can be made up of transitions of shadow. We'll get into that in the beginner drawing course or other stuff, down the line. But for now, just realize that as you're going around and doing the contours, you can go and work inside the forms too a little bit later. So if we were really copying this, we would definitely have the background dark and probably draw the cat in more of a, middle gray value and all that. But we're not worrying about values and tonal construction at this point. We're just learning about line-based construction. So, all right, I'm going to take this eye and raise it up a little bit. And I'm just squinting, still going around my drawing. This is the more relaxing part, but also the part where you get more specific about the shapes you're seeing and about the marks and lines you're making. Because this is where we're starting to close that gap, as I said earlier. And I want you to look at my face in the camera. Observe the squintage. The squint is important because as I squint, I can compare and contrast things better without looking at so much detail. So all that detail distracts from what I'm trying to get at. And what I'm trying to get at is just these nice cat shapes. Trying to get at them cat shapes, baby. So kind of got a little rough indication of an eye over there. We can put it in. And I know there's tons of detail inside this guy. It's a beautiful cat. He's got like all these little marks and stuff separating them, and we can figure out what to do with those in a little bit. But for now, again, I'm just teaching you the basics. I know you want to jump ahead. I can feel it. I can feel your impatience because I'm impatient. And it's just not going to help us at this point. We want to make sure that we are chilling out. I don't care how much coffee you had. If you need to go run around the block, do it safely. But come back when you're ready to give this step some chill kind of love. Like just don't rush it. It'll look not as good. So here we have, all these different shadow shapes, all these ways of separating the cat. I'm going to flip the canvas again because I want to keep checking and making sure I'm on the right track. For example, I didn't really close the nose off enough with my lines. And maybe I want to do just a little mark making to show the change in surface for the nose. Just a little bit of that mark making. It's looking like a cat now. It's looking more like a cat than it was. Got that nice little orb of its, of its muzzle. You got some little dots where the whiskers come out. And you can see just like with a little bit of pen pressure, you can start to make those dots. And these are some of the details we were talking about. So we're just adding only enough detail to really help sell the form or to sell what it is. Like this line right here going down here, I'm just doing a little mark making to show that. I don't really like these marks over here if we're going to get picky about it. But maybe I'll just leave the ones I did. And then, I'm really spending some good time on the face. That's always a humongous tip, is to make sure that if you're going to do the face nice. It just sounds so untechnical when I say it like that. Just if you're going to mess up somewhere, don't mess up on the face. Or at least minimize the amount you mess up on the face. I don't want to put too much pressure on y'all because you're beginners, and I don't want to scare you away. You really need to know that drawing is a learnable skill. It just takes a lot of practice and patience. And I wish I could sell you on like it's so easy. There's lots of easy drawings to do. It's like, yeah, the easy stuff comes with the easy results, which everybody can get. But the more you get into this, the more you enjoy it, the more you're going to want to push yourself. You're going to feel like you want to ride your bike a little faster. You may want to go off a jump. You've mastered being able to turn the corner and to use the brakes. That's simple stuff. But at this point, it's okay. It's okay just to enjoy studying, learning how to draw a cat. So let's see, what does it look like back here? So we have this big heavy line, which I felt was a little too strong, and it didn't really represent what I'm seeing back there. There's sort of a boxy little separation that I'm finding. It's kind of in the darkness, so it's not super easy to see, but it's got a little boxy separation back there, and then kind of juts out even more and goes back down. So we have this rough, big shape outline, but once we have that big, rough outline there, like I said, it doesn't need to be perfect because we're going to draw over it anyway. So we want to make sure that as we're drawing over that, we're getting those shapes pretty correct, because if we want to be done with the drawing after this and not do another drawing over it, then you might as well get it right at least the second time around. Eventually, you'll get to the point where you're super comfortable and one sketchy drawing just looks fun and good and interesting, but that's a lot of mileage. So as you can see, I'm just making like softer lines for the back here because we're really focused on the face. That's like the big selling point of the cat. And even then, I'll probably have to run around the eye a little bit there with some extra separations, just much softer, because it's not quite helping to sell the form as much as I would like. And even then, it's like once you put something in that doesn't work quite well, you're always going to have to adjust it. Like this is not an easy line to strike, but once you get one you like, you can just go back to it. And you notice I'm just like piecing together these lines, looking at the reference, looking at what I'm drawing, flipping the canvas, enjoying the process. So you see, we're just making marks up and down the forms, trying to get at the three-dimensionality. We're running the contour of our big shapes, but we're now able to focus on a little bit of detail. If we want to render this full thing out, that's something you can start doing at this point, but only after you've constructed the rest of this cat. So we have to construct the cat all the way through before we start to really do too much detailing. These are mostly just indicative of where I would start to break some of these shapes up and just showing you a little bit of mark making. Um, and it's mostly also to keep myself motivated, because that's a big part of the drawing process, is not making it too boring for yourself, because you won't finish the process. So at this point, I feel like we've explained most of what you're going to need to know, which is just scanning back and forth between what you drew initially and what you are kind of going over the various big shapes and medium shapes with. And if I were to go any further, I would probably need to make a whole new tutorial, because our lesson's already getting kind of long here for today's attention spans. So at this point, it would probably behoove you to just kind of finish off the drawing yourself. Like I said, I left this reference in the description box, and just see where you can take it. See where you can use mark making to detail it. See how you can measure these different pieces up. We already separated some of our shadow shapes, and I just kind of walked you through this process of learning to draw based on this nice little, just challenging enough cat. But if this was, really hard or too difficult, then I'll probably come out with some even more simple step-by-step stuff later. Again, I'm Tate Payton at thebeginnerdrawingcourse.com, where I help you face your fears and get further faster, and I will see you in the next video. Take care and happy drawing.